Well, fantastic to be back with Andy Worthington on a Mediterranean spring day in Brockley, really, isn't it?
Yeah, well, we've had this amazing weather for a week now, haven't we? And what a relief it is. Everyone just seems happier.
Yeah.
And I think we had an extremely long, difficult winter that, people were just shutting down, it seemed to me.
You saw a lot of that on the streets, didn't you? Yes, very much so. And the political weather is turbulent, but we can at least take a breath of fresh South London air and digest it, if not leisure, then with a sense of the unique perspective that you provide. We started talking about Elon Musk and a piece that you were reading in the American Atlantic, to which you've lately subscribed. Sorry, the American Prospect.
Yeah.
But as good, if not better.
Yeah, I mean, it's there's definitely some of the U.S. media is properly attacking the Trump administration for the absolute scale of their wanton destruction of the structure of the U.S. establishment. I think I'm not sure that's happening as much with the kind of mainstream broadcast media and the mainstream print media.
Normalisation of things. Because the format justifies it, or they're going to sack somebody if they don't conform.
Well, yeah, there's that. I mean, there are definitely people are intimidated and scared.
Yes.
But I get. I'm on the mailing list for the American Prospect, and it was the introductory paragraph was a very succinct analysis of just how screamingly insane it is that Elon Musk, unelected, with no congressional authority whatsoever, is just shredding the United States government, and how completely unjustifiable and wrong that is. And then the second paragraph was, and now let's talk about his drug use. And proceeded to tell us the story, most of which is from Elon Musk's own words about his chronic drug use of all kinds of drugs over the years, how it's caused so many problems in organizations that he's been involved in. And then suddenly I was thinking, okay, this explains quite a lot about him. He's off his head.
Which, as you say, with this, being the wealthiest man in the world, is perfectly okay.
No one can stop him. I mean, who's the grown-up in the room?
Yeah, it's been said, and I mean, obviously one has to take all of this with a pinch of salt, but he has been, in quotes, demoted, and there was the token Faragist falling out in some division of the White House in the last 24 hours. What that effectively means, we don't know. But there have been some legal challenges, haven't there? And I think with regard to health research, if I remember rightly, and air traffic controllers have to some extent been reinstated. But somebody observed the other day, where else are these people going to go with those skills? They're going to go. They're going to basically become less of an economic base. They're going to be less sellable under the tariffs, for one thing.
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, it's just incomprehensible to me that that Trump and the people around him think that making as many people unemployed as possible is going to be a winner for them.
Worked for Thatcher, didn't it? Allegedly.
Well, Thatcher's primary aim was to deindustrialise the UK. I thought, looking back on it, which was, and she had the weight of anti-union sentiment promoted by obviously parts of the establishment and the mainstream media on her side to suggest that Britain could no longer cope with disruptive unions, and that therefore destroying all of the industries that these unions were part of was unfortunate way forward. And it was just part of her plan, wasn't it? Because she was also, she wanted to make the transition to a kind of international banking sector that would be the primary driver of the economy.
And yuppies beget hipsters.
I think what's happening now, what's so disturbing about what's happening now is that it feels like after 40 years of neoliberalism, when we really should have exhausted all of the lies about the private sector is better than the public sector.
Yeah.
There will be a trickle down of wealth from the top to the bottom, all of which is just lies.
Yeah.
That we're now seeing a kind of turbocharged final flourish of neoliberalism with a government that is intent on destroying all federal government employment. So you're talking about, hundreds of thousands, possibly millions of people being made unemployed. Who's going to look after them? What are they going to do? Where's the work for them?
Yeah.
And to be replaced, I can see really by two things. One is the private sector steps in, as they always do, claiming to run things better, but actually running things worse and costing vast amounts more money.
While delivering less.
While delivering less. And the other route, of course, is that we don't know how much they'll be trying to replace human jobs with AI. I think that's another dangerous...
Well, of course, that's Musk's specialty, isn't it? Or his special area of interest.
Well, who knows what... if that's the case, and if we think of AI really as kind of tools that can be used to assess a huge amount of data, which I think is one of the kind of primary points of it. You set up...
It's a very polite explanation of it from an artist's point of view. But
you set up a system that, you program something to search through incomprehensibly huge amounts of data. Now, the problem is, it depends on the quality of the programming.
Yes.
So, so what we've already seen is that because they've got a kind of hit list of woke notions that they don't like, then anyone who's working in medical or psychological trauma, for example, is getting defunded because they programmed trauma to mean trauma related to gender issues and race issues.
Yes.
They're idiots. The other day, at his State of the Union address, I believe, Donald Trump was talking about defunding research into transgender mice. It's transgenic mice.
Yes.
He doesn't even know the difference. So the programming, the AI's ability to review vast amounts of data is only as good as the parameters that have been set by the people programming it. And I think it looks extremely chaotic to me, what happens when you just sit back and push a button and let these inadequate programs decide the futures of so many people.
Yeah. I mean, Woodcock, for example, who seems to be one of the brains of the operation at the moment, is a property magnate. And as Trump purports to be, but effectively has been other organisations that have variously tanked and withered away and whatnot, and then had vast injections of cash from mysterious sources at the 11th hour. I'm not talking about Putin yet, but anyway, howsoever. But so that's, in a sense, that's the sort of template for running things that we are asked to suck up, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, Trump seems very much to just be a kind of mafia boss to me. I mean, if you give him enough money, then he gives you power. I mean, that's surely the thing with Musk above all, is that Musk helped him win.
Yes.
And gave him huge amounts of money. I mean, Musk is making huge amounts of money as well, and also hemorrhaging money in other ways.
Yeah.
But if you do him a favour by giving him a load of cash, then he does you a favour back. So that's why with Israel and Gaza and the West Bank, I think the biggest problem is that he took $100 million from Miriam Adelson, who is the widow of a very prominent Zionist who made a fortune out of casinos, and she wants a return. And similarly, I think it was the same in Trump's first term.
Yeah.
This is a businessman whose most of his history has not been actually very successful. He has required support and bailouts from all kinds of people, transnationally. Yeah. So in his first term, it was a real worry within the States and people who were paying attention that it almost seemed clear that you couldn't trust the President of the United States to be representing the United States, because he was beholden to the interests of people outside the United States who had invested in him,
Yeah.
who had supported him, who had bailed him out.
Which makes sense in dodgy business terms, but in political terms, it doesn't translate in the way that we conventionally would expect. I suppose it might go back to 19th century Britain, where parliamentary candidates were sponsored, weren't they, effectively? You only got in, if you remember, the landed gentry, or latterly you had some sort of industrial power behind you.
Yeah, well, I mean, and I think most politicians everywhere we look these days are not clean in the sense that that they operate on the basis of principles. They operate on the basis so much of the time on who's paid them to lobby on whose behalf. It's shockingly clear everywhere that we look that a majority of politicians in the main parties appear to be corrupt. They are directly paid by Israel, by the arms companies, by fossil fuel companies to promote their interests. And it's one of the reasons, I think, that we have such a crisis in politics, because these are the centrist parties that have shown themselves to be so nakedly and openly corrupt. But the other side is no better. I mean, if we look at the States, the huge problem is that AIPAC and other Israel lobbyists own nearly all of Congress. They pay them vast amounts of money, hundreds of thousands of dollars a year, up to millions of dollars.
That is extraordinary
to promote Israel's interests above the interests of the United States.
Yeah.
Which is why we've ended up in a position where something like 2/3 of the states in the United States now, to get a job, you have to swear allegiance to Israel. You don't have to swear allegiance to the United States.
That is a little bit bonkers, isn't it? There's this other thing, isn't there? One also thinks of George Bush Jr., for example, and his very limited success in the oil field, of vaunted economic incompetence translating into political electability. But is it to do, then, with these bailouts that you inevitably need to have? And therefore you end up with a sort of caucus of the incompetent, with ever larger sums behind them.
Is it? I mean, maybe it's just the whole kind of super managerial situation of the world. I mean, if you look at one of the great crises in this country, which the Labour government is uninterested in addressing, which is the privatisation of water. The privatisation of water, which only England and Wales did, basically, in the whole world. Because it's such a stupid idea, and as we've been ripped off to the tune of tens of billions of pounds that hasn't been invested in water and has gone into the pockets of shareholders, and the government will not do anything about it. And if you look at the industry, the head of all the water companies are these anonymous people that you probably wouldn't even notice if they walked past you in the street, who are on salaries of several £million a year for running businesses that don't do the job that they're supposed to do, that all they do is accrue debt and service the requirements of their shareholders, and they sit at the top of this broken, failed system, being paid, £2 million a year for not doing their job. And then you look across the whole corporate sector, and it's absurd rewards for people who are figureheads, not even in companies that can claim to be a success in any way other than just making money for the people that they're supposed to make the money for. So I think we have a huge political problem, don't we? That we have the super rich rewarding each other, but not on the while the rest of us
rewarding each
are
other
in the real world,
in real world terms. Yeah.
And people are going like, "Oh, there's no money, so you can't have a job. I'm going to have to lay you off because I just can't afford you." And then up at the other end are just the multipliers. I mean, that's surely the great irony of Elon Musk, and that. I would hope it comes back to bite him. When the world's richest man is treating the jobs of hundreds of thousands or millions of people as disposable, as part of a game, is America going to accept that? I mean, so the problem we have is that America slavishly adores success. America has fought for decades to eliminate any notion of socialist responsibility, tarnishing it as communism and a huge threat. But I would hope that people in the United States in significant numbers will be saying this is the most absurd position that we're in, that the world's richest man is tanking our entire system and making so many of us unemployed. And that is the kind of bitterest irony that you can imagine and completely unacceptable. But we'll see.
Yeah. It was suggested by a pundit on Al Jazeera, I think, last night, that America is in grave danger of coming second in the economic race to China. Now, the global picture is by no means clear at the moment, but the suggestion was that all this razzmatazz is covering up, and indeed the tariffs is covering up this essential fact, the fact that people are going to have to adjust to, unless there is some effectively Keynesian, which there isn't going to be, introduction of infrastructure into America, that kind of intervention, then things are going to wither a little bit, and that America's isolationism is going to turn it into a very different place.
I think so, yeah, and I think actually, we might as well include Europe in looking at so many aspects of that. It's interesting, Andy, isn't it, how little we hear about China?
Yeah.
So I get a certain amount of information about China from people that I follow on X, who will post things that I do not see in the mainstream media about the extent of the transformation of Chinese society. And and if we look at certain aspects like electric vehicle production, for example,
yes,
they seem to be miles ahead of the rest of the world. So if the United States is feeling threatened by China, they're feeling threatened because of China's success. They're feeling threatened, if they were honest, by their own failure. But they don't want to recognize their own failure. They want to pin the blame on their rival, who is actually doing what they should be doing successfully. And if we then look at the United States and most of Europe, then we have to say what's happened. And we've had 40 years of neoliberalism, of trying to shift as much money and profit in the direction of the super rich at the expense of entire infrastructures, at the expense of any genuine investment in things that we would once have been world leaders in, and that we kind of deserve everything that we're getting. I mean, if you look at this country, we've got a government that campaigned on nothing, essentially status quo. We are the same as the Tories, but we're wearing different
bit nicer
suits.
About it, sort of thing.
I'm not even sure they're nicer about it.
Yeah, well, indeed, it's proved.
But, they say there's no money, so they're clearly, all they're doing is, this is a country that's been almost entirely sold off and run down and degraded over decades. And they're saying there's no money. We're not going to think outside the box as to, maybe tax the rich. We're going to go yet again to private companies to even more privatise what's left. There's almost nothing left to privatise, so it's going to be like a hyper privatisation of. I think we mentioned before the whole Freeport notion, where they're intending, and the Tories were in on this as well, intending to hand over control of entire counties essentially to private companies.
That's some small print you very usefully mentioned. You won't read that anywhere else.
Well, it's worth looking into, isn't it?
It is.
But this is what happens, I think, when you hollow out your countries to such an extent that you that if you won't take a radical approach by, first of all, understanding that you can borrow money as a major economy without, you've got Rachel Reeves pretending that it has to be in the kitty box.
Yeah.
It's like, no, you can borrow and print money when you're a government. There are things that you can do.
Yes.
And the fact that they won't go after the big money people, they're just endlessly bashing pensioners and the disabled, and I mean these narratives are the same as the Tories, aren't they? All people must work. Profoundly disabled people cannot work. Why are you repeatedly going out there and bashing them? What is this? So I think the West is in the doldrums, and I think it's self-inflicted.
Yeah. A couple of things in there, Andy. I mean, as you say, the maintenance of Tory tropes, I would have thought, is presumably mindful of the fact that Richard Tyson reform are waiting in the wings in some of these sort of red wall areas, blue wall areas, however you style them these days. At the demise of Badenoch, I think, probably is all over bar the shouting. But also, you mentioned earlier on that this is, in your view, the last gasp of neoliberalism. They're just throwing everything at it. It's the greatest hit store. So it begs the question of what's going to come after and when people will, as it were, wake up.
Well, and that's the question, isn't it? So we have to look at the states at the moment, because we have to look at whether their particular model is going to work, or if it's going to fail. If it does fail, how badly it's going to fail. You would think in a lot of ways it's going to fail miserably, but there's a lot of strands to what's happening in the States. I mean, one of them is the kind of Gilead Handmaid's Tale aspect of creating, some monstrous white nationalist Christian nation in which women know their place, and which I think is J.D. Vance is the emblem.
Margaret Atwood has said everything in The Handmaid's Tale has in some form pretty much happened.
In
microcosm. Yeah.
So that's part of the story, but another part of the story is the flailing of a society of. I mean, look at his government. I mean, it's full of billionaires. Could you be more out of touch with the concerns of ordinary American people? No, absolutely not. And so they're trying desperately to peddle narratives that ignore the realities and pretend that it's all about immigrants and wokeness. Well, we're on our way to that again, it seems, in this country, because the Labour Party has failed to express anything that the public can grab onto to suggest that they care about us and that they want to make a change after 14 years of horrendous Tory rule. Nothing. They won't do anything. It's like they're paid to do nothing. And so people are drifting again to the far right. You think, how on earth is that possible after 14 years of the Tories drifting to the far right and failing? But this seems to be what happens. People shift from one side to another, as has happened in the States. So Trump was a disaster. Biden came in. And then suddenly people tire of Biden, and suddenly it's forgotten that Trump was a disaster. And then the rhetoric gets more and more cranked up. I mean, the notion that Farage and Richard Tice could run anything competently is just deranged. But it's like, are we going to have to go through that to find out that they offer nothing?
The word that's in the back of my head is amateur. Amateur hour. It seems to be that the folksy aspect of Trump seems to play to this, Well, I'm just a little guy, really. I happen to have a whole pile of money here. Let's see what happens if we do this. Kaboom.
Well, there's definitely no interest in coherence, is there? Because he's fundamentally incoherent. So, I mean, he'll... we're constantly having to watch him, make grand pronouncements because they sound bitey and they play well. And they get him a lot of attention. And then, very little, really, analysis of how barking mad so many of these things are, and that they'll collapse.
As I said, Boris didn't do detail in the mayoralty as well as the Prime Minister.
So I think we're dealing with a kind of incoherence that if people are happy to accept that, then that's quite worrying, because people are living by feelings about things and sound bites rather than having any analysis of what's really happening.
I wonder how it also plays, and we were talking optimistically in a sort of William Morrissey way that a little while ago about community action. There are places in America off the map, aren't there? There are places in Britain, I would suggest, off the map that we never really hear about, where somehow or other they have scrimped and saved and survived and got things up. This is where, again, I wouldn't call that amateur. I would call that protean, or something different, perhaps. I don't know how you would feel about it. But there is a sense in which that as Joe Hill once said, don't mourn organise. When you take that forward, you end up with some sort of a something, possibly something like Jeremy Corbyn's momentum.
Right.
In terms of the people who get involved and where they come from, where their heart is. I suppose if anything's going to counter this, it will be like that, wouldn't it? But are we then saying that political structures, per se, as they've been traditionally devised, are on the way out?
Well, it's an interesting one. I mean, when you were talking then, it made me think about, the revitalization of Detroit, for example, by the people of Detroit.
Interesting example. Yes.
Formerly an industrial powerhouse that collapsed, and and people living there on the ground started to try to remake Detroit in a different way that would function. So I think examples like that look hugely important, but the problem is that we have to rid ourselves of both of the major parties before that kind of thing can happen. Obviously, we both know, I feel pretty sure, that if you got Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell together and said, guys, get a load of experts together who can think outside the box in a way that involves socialism and left-wing thinking, and how we might do something different going forward, we could have our cities greened, full of produce that is being grown in every available space. It's like, change would be possible.
The stuff that's in the brochure, but is actually happening.
Yeah, we're stuck with systems that just don't want any meaningful change, and they're ruinous and broken, and only getting worse. I think.
Does this leave you on balance a tad optimistic about the residue of the next 4 years, for all the collateral damage that it will no doubt bring and is bringing?
I don't think he's going to. Survive 4 years with the intensity of him just tearing up everything. I remember thinking it when he got in the first time, and at the time he was working very closely with Steve Bannon, who's a major wrecking ball of a human being.
Still on the case, isn't he?
And I felt that their intention then was to be like the Nazis, but without the paperwork. That their intention was to literally just go in, ransack and destroy government departments, but not leave a paper trail. The Nazis were very meticulous in their record keeping.
They were.
And actually, it's been funny seeing what's happening this time around, as seeing that back again, but much more determined this time with Musk, just hurling sulfuric acid at the entire structure of the federal government.
It's the keystroke now, isn't it? Whereas it would have been, as you say, formerly a protein document. Prolix documentation, say. And then some sort of a proposal and enacting of the proposal. Now it's just done.
Yeah, I don't think they'll get away with it. I mean, I think there's very fundamental issues about his abuse of Congress and the judiciary. So we're seeing the courts respond. There was just a few days ago there was an absolutely brilliant court opinion by a judge refuting the ability of the Trump administration to sack this senior woman in one of the federal government organizations, and these results coming through. What Trump's fundamentalist Christian neoliberal backers, the Project 2025 people, want is to remove all woke judges, but they can't do that overnight. I think they will hit buffers in if they got their way, they would just sack everybody and then they would just put their own people in. But it's not as simple as they think to do that, fortunately, for all of us. Otherwise we would have some militant theosophy, theological based white supremacist America would just happen like that, but they're going to meet resistance.
Outward, as you say, shows how that can happen by degrees, but it will happen steadily, won't it? It will happen covertly.
And I think with Congress, he's also running into problems, because, what Musk has been empowered to do is suggest that money that has been allocated by Congress, it doesn't matter that Congress has allocated that funding. It absolutely matters for the separation of powers in the United States to prevent executive overreach, that you can't scrap money that has been allocated by Congress. That is what Congress does. And the president is a part of a system, not the dictator sitting above it all. So,
That's such important implications, doesn't it?
And I think he's so much of what he's doing is so destructive that it will be economically destructive.
Yeah.
And that will not make him popular. You don't, it's the economy, stupid, isn't it? At the end of the day, people particularly care about how they feel economically. And if you've got a government that is just a wrecking ball, that is showing contempt for so many people and their precarious existence and their ability to survive, I just don't think that's a winner.
Yeah. Well, I suppose life expectancy has been a thing in this country. It is, I think, in parts of the northeast, it is decreasing a little bit. In parts of America, it's decreasing very noticeably.
Yeah.
Bernie Sanders was pointing out the other day. People will start to notice this when people, I suppose, have expectations of quality of life. And I suppose some people look at this and they go off-grid. But at the same time, it's a question of where you end up with something echoic, at least, of a sort of liberal values, don't you? You think, well, my life is worth something, my contribution is worth something, my later life and old age are worth something. So you end up with implications there of a sort of social contract.
Yes, yeah, exactly. We're not dealing with abstract things here. We're dealing with people who, at any stage of their life, may find themselves, out on the streets because the balance of the money that they get and the support networks that need to be in place to preserve a difficult and unequal system will fall apart. Because the bottom line of everything that they've been trying to do, kind of everywhere in the West for decades, is to suggest that everyone has to stand on their own 2 feet. If you don't, you're a loser and an abuser of the system. Let's just go back to looking at Liz Kendall now and her violent denunciations of disabled people. She's not speaking to me. I completely understand that within society are people who are severely physically or mentally disabled, who need the support of the state. Where else is it going to come from? It's certainly not going to come from you beating them with sticks and telling them that they're lazy. That's just horrendous.
Remind us what she said, would you? I have to say I missed this. I was up in the Wells at the time.
Oh, she's just saying that everybody should work. That there are no excuses for not working. It's the usual thing that governments do. It's exactly the same as what the Tories did. Yeah. It's the same as what I remember New Labour doing. It's the same, every government does.
And there's a distinction, I guess, between that and everybody feeling they can contribute, people feeling empowered.
Yeah, well, you just don't start by bashing the people who need your support. Yeah. Because another extension of that is like, well, how dare old people? How dare old people think that they can retire? And and this money. So the money that we all pay in is multiplied through investment and through a certain amount of government support. That's how pensions work. But we've been creeping ever closer to a notion where they suggest, and Elon Musk is very much on this. He's called it the whole of Social Security a Ponzi scheme.
Yeah.
If you were to cross-examine a lot of senior Labour people, I think that you would find that they would be suggesting that everybody needs to save up and look after themselves.
And if you think of the Keir Hardie factor in their origins, it's a long way from that, isn't it?
A very long way from that.
So back with Andy Worthington. It's International Women's Day today. The wonderful Dot breezed in earlier on. She's off to an art show. And as a creator, as a theatre maker, as an artist herself, she's a glorious example of the yin to the yang. But as blokes, I think, it's pretty evident that the shape that women get in modern life, for all their success and the battles that they continue to fight, isn't all that great, is it?
Well, no. I mean, it's, we should all remember the huge battles that were fought in this country by women to break through the chronic inequality that is the lot of most societies throughout human history, where the men dominate, and those achievements are so huge. Compared to so many other places in the world where women haven't been able to get together and fight back. And, I think we should always remember the efforts of the suffragettes. And, of course, I also think in terms of where we're at now, that the spirit of the suffragettes is very similar to the spirit of the people who are resisting the refusal of our governments and corporations to deal with climate change, which is, involves both men and women, and of all ages. So I wasn't trying to detract from the International Women's Day thing there. It's hugely important, and of course the great irony is that are the other 364 days of the year men's days.
Yeah, indeed. Or, as a friend of mine's lyric once said, excuses for men's days, in the sense that there's patriarchy and then there's proper manhood.
Right.
Which you're a fine and upstanding example. One also thinks of the pink hats in the first Trump administration. Conspicuous by their absence this time, and there's often thought to be, as we were saying in America generally, a bit of mission creep, because you start off with the razzmatazz and everyone thinks isn't this great, and then you think, my God, we didn't get all that far with Kamala, and the consensus is that she didn't, not for perhaps for want of trying, fight a particularly successful campaign. And the buttons that she pressed were not those that resonated with a lot of people.
Yeah.
Is she a figurehead for the place in which women are at now, geopolitically? In which case, how do they move beyond that situation?
Well, there's quite a lot going on there. It's interesting. I was in the States when Donald Trump first became president.
Were you?
And I was on that massive march in New York.
Brilliant.
It was huge. It was an absolute huge outpouring of female fury against the sex criminal Donald Trump becoming president, and then I suppose it faded away. It's like maybe this is the problem we always have: is that it's impossible to sustain the high points that you reach. Where it's like, guys, if you're gonna, you need to make sure the next time there are even more people.
Yeah.
And then you probably need a general strike.
Yeah. Yeah.
And, and that never becomes the way forward for any kind of velvet revolutionary idea. It's like, most people end up respecting the broken institutions that we have and actually coming down to the notion that if you don't like it, in 4 or 5 years you can vote against it. Ignoring the fact that in the US and the UK, very noticeably, our systems are broken and inadequate in the fact that we aren't represented properly. We have first past the post in this country. The United States has this ridiculous system of allocating votes where the same amount of, a state with no people in it has 2 senators, as does California, which is, to me, seems equivalent to the rotten boroughs of the 19th century in its complete lack of representation of the people. Kamala, Well, the big problem with Kamala is that it wasn't just her; it was the party that she represents, and it's the problem that obviously the party was tainted by its complicity in genocide, but also was tainted by its neoliberal inability to enthuse people about things that count. So who's failing where? I suppose is key to this, isn't it? It's like. The Democrats, like the Labour Party here, can always count on millions of votes from people who,
lifelong voters.
Lifelong voters. They're not all poor people. This is across the economic spectrum.
It's a sort of heritage thing, isn't it?
Yeah, and and the Republican, it works the same way for Republicans. So it's like it's always about who you're appealing to, who might change their mind.
Memphis is a black town, but because of the Civil War, they will never vote Democrat.
Yeah. And so it's that middle ground that is the really difficult area, and the same version of we're dealing with a version of that here. That however much Farage may be starting to be a bit discredited because of his seeming Russian connections.
And some convicted fraudster funded his most recent expedition, didn't he?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's going to be a hard one for him to power through. But at some level, he's appealing to people who feel disenfranchised.
Oh, he's just a naughty boy. Oh.
Even though he's got nothing really constructive to offer. And the same problem with the Democrats is like how are they going to come back from this to suggest to the American people that there needs to be a swing that would endorse them to take power and maybe to hold it for 2 terms rather than for 1.
Yeah.
And again, I would suggest that it's the same problem here, that they can't break away from their neoliberalism, from the fact that they're catering for the wealthy, that they don't have much interest in the poorer people who make up the bulk of society. That's the problem here, isn't it?
Yes, it's fascinating how the one starts to mirror the other, isn't it? And perhaps this is why Starmer goes over to the White House, and there are a lot of, knowing nods, as it were. The same game is being played in different ships, as it were. Now, Bernie Sanders is on tour, sponsored by himself and crowdfunding, and he's going to Trump areas to say, well, have you noticed? What faith do you put in a lone figure like that? What faith do you put in the idea of that version of the pioneering spirit? Because he's been at it a long time now. I mean, we can just about remember him, I guess, can't we, as a young man, when he was the bright young senator from Vermont, which he still is.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think the bottom line, the problem always seems to be that although he's, he can be a radical within the Democratic Party, he's still part of the Democratic Party machine. And maybe it's the problem that we've got. It's
just affiliated now.
It mirrors something that we've got here, where actually, Jeremy Corbyn wanted to remain a member of the Labour Party. I mean, it's only because Keir Starmer was obsessed with getting rid of him that he's now an independent. Yeah. Labour, the good Labour Party MPs, the ones who remember socialism, who are obviously in a small minority within the party, but they still have an allegiance to the notion of what they think the Labour Party should be, even though it isn't. It feels very much like we need a new left alternative, but the problem is how you do that in systems that are rigged primarily to facilitate electoral success by one of 2 major parties. That's the problem we've always had in this country. Yeah? If you vote Green, if you vote Liberal Democrat, you have to get 20, 30 times more voters to get a seat than if you're with one of the big parties. Yes. It's a rigged system. It's broken.
Yes.
We need the left, I think, Andy. We need resolute voices on the left to say that they're standing up for the people. We need resolute voices on the left to say to say, I'm sorry about all the misinformation, and I'm going to have to address the anger that you feel that is misdirected, but the problems are not immigration, the problems are not woke ideology, the problems are systemic problems with capitalism and overexploitation, which does not just affect the rest of the world, it affects us. We need a system that believes in prioritizing the needs of as many people as possible, over the greed of the few. Where are these voices? I mean,
they don't have. This is, I guess, I'm saying the bleeding obvious here, aren't they? They don't have serious money behind them. I mean, is it Jim Ratcliffe, is supposedly a socialist millionaire, the guy behind Manchester United, not doing so at the moment as a club, but there are people like that who have those sorts of ideas behind them, but they're, for some reason, entering the political fray is not something they do or feel they want to do.
Yeah, I mean, there's some, there were great people out there, Andy, obviously, if you go looking for them, aren't there? I don't think the mainstream really promotes people, but I mean, just the last few days I've seen a couple of clips. One was Christopher Hitchens, not somebody that I particularly admired, but it was him forensically destroying the rationale behind Israel's behaviour. Yeah. Towards the Palestinians, with an intelligence and a coherence that it just made me think, where is this in our modern world? Someone speaking like this and being given a platform. And then the other was a clip of Tony Benn from the Commons delivering just one of his just astonishingly good speeches.
Yeah, the former Viscount Stansgate.
I mean, and we are lacking. We're lacking prominent people with a moral compass in public life.
He left Parliament to spend more time in politics, didn't he? But I suppose again, there's the paradox, isn't it? And do you attempt these things from within, as you say, Sanders is doing, or do you start something anew, which, for example, Extinction Rebellion, who we talked about last time, have attempted to do?
Well, it's very difficult because when so much is stacked against us, maybe that is the biggest dilemma of our times, is how we bring left-wing thought back into the mainstream and be able to build on it.
But we find the essence of it, as you say, in something like Christopher Hitchens, who is beyond right and left in that sense, isn't he? It's just saying, look, this is how it is.
Yeah. Well, I mean, people being able to make coherent intellectual arguments about things and being allowed to do that in front of an audience is, we're living in a much more fragmented world. There are all kinds of great people out there, but most of them are not household names in the way that. There would have been a time you would switch on the news and you would hear Tony Benn speaking, or you would be told that Christopher Hitchens did something, and that they would do an arts program probably where they spoke to Christopher Hitchens. I mean, he had a big influence within the kind of British media establishment. In a way that I don't think the British media establishment prioritises people of intelligence very much anymore at all.
Presumably because of who now owns it. Curiously, this is not necessarily related, but I think the Wall Street Journal has turned on Trump recently. And so there's Rupert Murdoch, if not expressing balance, expressing that the press is doing something like what the press used to do. Also interesting that there's a film about to be released by Hacked Off about the case for Leveson 2.
Okay.
The ad hominem attacks that occur, particularly, I suppose, in Trumpian terms, don't they, where you go after people and the press are encouraged to go after people.
Yeah, well, I mean, we have a huge problem of the concentration of media power in the hands of a few people. I mean, I think it's much more a prominent problem in the United States. Fox and various other right-wing channels that are basically operating in a kind of media wilderness. So the amount of people who only get their information from Fox and from... we don't see it at all, really. But you know the other one, Newsmax or something?
Something like that. There's a new one, isn't there?
So, you know, we don't have that here. I would say the bigger problem that we have here is that there has been a kind of rightward drift amongst broadcasters and liberal newspapers in this country, where they are way to the right of where they used to be, in terms of if you were to put them on the spot, what's your opinion about this? They would come up with something woolly, whereas once upon a time it wouldn't have been woolly. I mean, I look at Channel 4 News, where I like some of the people who work there. I don't like some of the other people who work there. Their overall editorial tone is one that has firmly shut the door on Jon Snow.
Yes, that was the moment, wasn't it?
That's the example to look at of imagining Jon Snow being told in editorial meetings, no, we're not going to say that. That's, yeah.
I'd like to see them try. Obviously, off he walked.
No, but the other big problem that we've got is so in this country where we don't have that kind of dominance of the right wing media in an otherwise completely empty media landscape, which is just such a huge problem in the States. But what we now have is a whole other world of
blogospheres,
of chaos, of social media,
podcasts and social media, particularly. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I don't follow Elon Musk. Why do I see Elon Musk's messages in my feed on X all the time?
Yeah.
Why, even if I blocked Elon Musk, would I see Elon Musk? Because he has created for himself a platform where he has a kind of media control that no one has had before. If he's beaming his messages into the feeds of tens of millions of people, without any of us having asked him to do that or given him permission, that's really quite extraordinary, isn't it?
Yes. I suppose it's a little bit Henry Ford in that sense, isn't it? I mean, literally, if you buy the brand and that's the only choice that you have. But in time, I mean, other platforms have come along like Blue Sky and whatnot, and they may not have the provenance of the big guys, but at the same time, there is the potential for people to start things up on a low base, isn't there?
There is. I mean, I suppose I suppose the trouble with social media is not just that it's Elon Musk, is that also he can promote all kinds of far-right voices. And if we look across the whole kind of social media landscape and, the various video channels that operate, there's a huge amount of very difficult and problematic far-right views reaching huge audiences. And I just don't really know what to do about that, Andy. I mean, I just saw a headline today. I haven't read the article, but I know I've been seeing it mentioned in recent months about a significant number of young people. I don't know whether it's mostly men, but who are attracted to Reform and Nigel Farage.
Yes.
How is that possible?
This is curious, isn't it? Is Farage the dad they never quite saw enough of? I don't know.
You would think that if he was your father figure, he would be a dodgy father figure that you wouldn't want to be getting close to. But I don't know.
There's some. I think there's a potential interesting rabbit hole there about modern fatherhood, again, of which you are a bespoke exemplar. But that's possibly the exception that proves the rule when everybody is so stretched and men are in quandaries about this, that, and the other.
Yeah, well, I don't know, but it does seem to. It's a worrying thing. I think that none of us have the ability to take on these giant juggernauts of dangerous far right thought And I suppose to go back to where we were before, it's why we need a major left-wing political presence to start asserting itself and to start attracting more people, because all of the themes are there, and we remember 10 million people voted for Jeremy Corbyn. They knew exactly that Jeremy Corbyn wasn't a fanatical far-left lunatic, that he was a centre-left socialist, and that people were quite happy to take that message on board. And the lack of an alternative voice is the thing that's just really, really troubling.
Do you feel there are voices out there that are disempowered by the political moment? And what are the possible solutions to this? Or is it, as we've sometimes speculated, there are lots of small groupings across the land who coalesce informally but haven't really got any sort of grand coalition aspiration? Yeah,
I mean, I think the biggest problem, the reason I was mentioning Christopher Hitchens and Tony Benn, is that we don't have the presence of left-wing public intellectuals in public life, in the media, in the way that we need. And, and if we're looking at it from that point of view, then part of the problem is the stranglehold on the mainstream media. And I would say the BBC, for example, is a very good case.
Indeed.
The BBC's chronic bias in support of Israel over the long months of that genocide, that's a huge problem. There was absolutely no way that anyone taking a responsible position about Israel's aggression could break through those protections that were put in place to defend Israel.
I think arguably it crosses a line against its own charter. And indeed some of the journalists went on strike and now being investigated by the Starmer government for putting out a documentary, I think.
And then I think we'd also find that's a problem as well. Maybe with the BBC, it particularly goes back to the confected case against the BBC by Tony Blair and Alistair Campbell at the time of the Iraq War, where they kind of broke the BBC at that point, and threatened to destroy them for telling the truth about a sexed-up dossier, and installed, which is also partly the kind of drift of New Labour policies, that you've had an editorial control, which is, if not overtly Tory, is very centrist and very establishment.
Sort of pliant, as it were,
Well, right wing, essentially. I think it's reinforcing the notion that the problem that we've had is that everything is drifting to the right.
Yeah.
So centre left has drifted to the centre and has become centre right. If you look at the development of the Labour Party, whereas and then the Tory Party has gone from being right wing to far right. Now we've got a Reform Party which is barkingly far right. It's very, very skewed.
So as you say, you end up with a normalisation of those far right nuances, don't you?
Yeah, and there are gatekeepers controlling it, Andy. There are definitely gatekeepers. I mean, Question Time would be a good example. The chronic right-wing political bias that there is on Question Time.
Aligned to the former English Defence League.
What on earth is that happening every week?
Yeah.
Every week. The panel will come out and you'll just go well, this is 80% to the right. It's ridiculous.
How is this in the public mind that loves the BBC the way it loves the NHS and all that? Going to differ from that general idea that was around in popular culture. I have to say, you may know more than I where precisely it came from, that as one matures, one is supposed to become a little more centrist, a little more right-wing, a little less tolerant, and through the bitter fruit of experience. Now, this is by no means universally true, but you now had, if that trope were true, you think of someone like Mick Jagger, for example, when he's occasionally quoted about this thing, who's, pretty much an uber-capitalist, apparently quite a nice bloke with it, but he's those early days of living out the back of an old transit van, long gone. How can that be differentiated? Is it a thing? And is it a thing that's governing the way people are tolerating effectively what is, as you say, naked bias?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I've always thought that getting more miserable and more right-wing as you get older is a funny one, because it completely is contradicted by a notion that the Americans have, which is also, only loosely based on the truth, which is that there's no room for any kind of politics or compassion in your youth. The requirement of an uber-capitalist society is that you become successful. Yeah. And then, as you get older, then you become left
philanthropy,
because you have made enough money to succeed in the system, and at that point you are kind of obliged to become more concerned about issues like compassion and empathy, which is an interesting one. Again, I think if we were, that's not something that I hear in relation to the UK. All I ever hear is this narrative about people getting angrier and more bitter and more right-wing as they get older.
I remember picking up the Mayfair Times on a bus in Highgate after the trim once, and just casually, it's one of these arts and property magazines, and it was a whole feature on philanthropy and young Asian people figuring out where to put their money.
Right.
We literally had too much of it. Dot-com bubble time.
Right, yeah.
That was a thing for a while, and I think the Tories picked up on it, if I remember rightly, when some of the major arts institutions began to wobble a bit. They thought, well, there's one way through here. It's long since gone.
I think there's a huge problem with people getting older and more miserable and more right wing. I think it's an existential crisis.
There's your question time audience, or the perception that's people watch, they want to watch themselves, as it were.
But I think it's also important to recognise that this has been partly created.
Yeah.
So when the Tories got in 2010 under Cameron and Osborne, and their brain. The brain behind their campaign was an Australian man called Linton Crosby.
Yes, indeed, yeah.
That was all about negative politics. Everything about campaigning was black propaganda, misery,
the enemy within,
and that has dictated so much of politics ever since. Look at the States and look at what Trump's message is. All of this negative messaging about immigrants, about woke ideology. It's all about making people angry. Look at the way that social media works. It encourages, it promotes people who are angry and intolerant over people who have got something positive to say.
Yeah, to say, however daft the grumpiness ends up sounding, it just seems to perpetuate itself.
And obviously, I think we all have a personal responsibility, not just for ourselves, but for our position in the larger society. And there seems to be no basis. There's no evolutionary basis. There's no obvious social basis for defending misery. There just isn't. We're capable of so much as human beings. We're capable of so many wonderful things and so many terrible things. But to have reached a position, which I think has been happening over a couple of decades, let's say, where the immiseration of people, where the darkness, the anger of people has been promoted and is promoted and is promoted, is a conspicuous failure of society as a whole. We shouldn't be tolerating this. We shouldn't be accepting it. This is a kind of mental illness of people in one of the most fortunate places in one of the most fortunate times in history are complaining about how they're having a hard time. Please spare me.
Isn't it interesting, as you were saying at the top of this, that Elon Musk is more or less saying that he has been mentally ill, he's had drug-induced psychosis or something like it, and he's made decisions whilst under the influence of these conditions. And people look at Trump's presentation and sort of wonder sometimes, don't they? To some extent, I suppose you can, if you have a modicum of self-awareness, you can stylise, you can script this, and it normalises it that way. But there comes a time where, like George Bush Senior, you end up with your head in the soup.
Yeah.
Well, as ever, Andy, I've we conclude these conversations on pause, but with a deep sense of the possible.
Yes.
Here's to the wonderfulness and human nature of which this is a small and vital corner.
Well, let's hope so, Andy. It's funny, really, because we kind of stopped there, didn't we? Kind of gazing into the void of trying to understand how these deeply dysfunctional people have such power.
Yeah.
And maybe it will just be a phase. I certainly hope that it's just a phase, and that we will recognise that actually we need intelligent people who are capable of assessing the situation and assessing people's needs. We need compassion. We need care. And this has all been being thrown out, hasn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, we remember from the Brexit years here, Michael Gove saying people have had enough of experts. So, I'm sorry, what kind of vandalistic thought is that to be suggesting to people with an anti-intellectual impulse that actually they're dead right?
And
the last thing that you need is people who knows anything about anything.
Yeah.
Because that all of this has contributed to the world where people's feelings are paramount. It's like, your feelings are real, but you also have to analyse reality and political situations. You have to be able to analyse yourself.
One of my clients I put a bit of psychological jargon to one of my clients the other day, and I said, well, somebody might say of something that happened to you 5 years ago that it was a lack of emotional regulation, and I was expecting to have things thrown at me because they really had been in the wars, but they said, I think they might be onto something there.
Right.
And I thought that's very big of them, considering the epic thing, disastrous stuff they were living through. But this sense that the still small voice, as you rightly say, whatever situation you're in, can be incredibly valuable.
Yeah.
That
absolutely.
critical faculty.
Yeah. Well, that's part of maturity, isn't it? As a human,
Exactly.
Is to recognise, that you may have been wrong.
Yeah. And how often do we hear politicians saying that?
How often? Well, exactly.
You might hear it if you're a fly on the wall at 4 o'clock in the morning.
Yeah.
But, anyway, thank you as ever, compadre.
Thank you, Andy. Yeah, great.
Cheers. Always a pleasure.